Hello everyone and welcome back to Science with Sarah. Today we'll be talking about type 2 diabetes. So if you haven't watched my previous video on insulin resistance, I strongly recommend that you do so before watching this one. Let's get started. First, I want to talk about statistics. According to the CDC, in 2018, a little over 10% of Americans, or 34.2 million people, had diabetes. And within the span of 20 years, the number of adults diagnosed with diabetes has more than doubled. Also, 1 in 3 people have prediabetes. These are huge numbers, and it has become a massive public health issue, especially in terms of costs. In 2019, the costs of non-insulin diabetes medication, so those for type 2 diabetes, has increased by over 75% when compared to the prices in 2014 for the same medications. So the costs of the medicines are extremely high. The cost to the healthcare industry is high too, but also the cost to you and your well-being is high. So first, I want to answer a simple question. What is prediabetes? Prediabetes is the stage before type 2 diabetes. It's when your blood sugar levels are higher than what they should be, but they're not high enough to be actually diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So as I said, 1 in 3 American adults has prediabetes, and 84% of those with prediabetes don't know they have it. This is a crazy number, so it's really important to talk about type 2 diabetes because 1 in 3 people are at risk of getting it. The next question I want to address is what is the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes? I did want to make sure that you know we are talking about type 2 diabetes and that it is different from type 1 diabetes. In type 1 diabetes, your beta cells cannot make insulin, so all the normal processes we spoke about in the previous videos about the storage function of insulin can't happen because they can't produce insulin. People with type 1 diabetes have to take insulin to control their blood sugars that go up after eating. On the other hand, type 2 diabetes is acquired and affects about 90% of people with diabetes in general. In the development of type 2 diabetes, people typically become insulin resistant or just can't make enough insulin in general, either because of their genes or diet or lifestyle, among other factors. So what happens in your body when you have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes? So as I mentioned before, insulin resistance is a big factor that contributes to the development of type 2 diabetes. Once your cells are starting to become resistant to insulin, your pancreas senses there's still glucose in your blood, so it keeps on producing insulin to try and get rid of the glucose in the cells. This process of insulin resistance rising slowly and your body being able to still produce enough insulin to keep the blood sugar relatively at normal levels is called compensatory hyperinsulinemia. And since through this, your blood sugar is slowly rising at the same time, this is typically where you begin to see prediabetes. Then the beta cells in the pancreas are starting to get exhausted from pumping out so much insulin, and they start becoming dysfunctional. After a while, the pancreas will then start to fail. And when the beta cells become dysfunctional, your blood sugar starts rising even more, and that's when they'll reach the levels that you'll be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So who gets type 2 diabetes? The prevalence of the disease is highest among American Indians or Alaska Natives, then among Hispanics, then among non-Hispanic Blacks, and finally non-Hispanic Asians, followed by non-Hispanic whites, with Hispanics having a 66% increased risk of getting it than non-Hispanic whites. Non-Hispanic Blacks have a 77% increased risk of getting it than non-Hispanic whites. Another observation is that the risk of getting the disease is 40 to 60% higher among individuals in communities of lower socioeconomic status. So why are individuals in communities of low socioeconomic class at greater risk of developing the disease? So I found a really great research paper about this, and I cited it below if you'd like to read it, but I will summarize it here to answer this question. So first, people of lower socioeconomic status will have less access to healthcare and may be unable to afford health insurance since going to the doctor will be a huge burden on their income. Second, the financial burden of going to the doctor doesn't stop there because people that are in these communities may not even be able to manage the condition once it is diagnosed. For example, the costs of medicine and of nutritious, healthy foods. Third, the day-to-day life of living paycheck to paycheck for people of these communities induces chronic stress, which has tremendous biological effects. High levels of stress can lead to anxiety and depression and decreased energy and motivation, which could ultimately result in unhealthy choices such as smoking or eating unhealthy foods. High stress levels also increase blood pressure and blood sugar levels. Finally, the current guidelines and management of type 2 diabetes does not take into account these societal factors. These factors lead to further poverty and social exclusion and exacerbates the cycle of inequality. So why is type 2 diabetes a problem? Type 2 diabetes is a major cause of blindness, heart disease, kidney disease, stroke, amputation, foot ulcers, and is even a risk factor for Alzheimer's. Diabetes is the 7th leading cause of death in the United States, and it is the first cause of kidney failure, lower limb amputation, and adult blindness. So what are the current guidelines for the management of this disease? The only way you can reverse your type 2 diabetes is by lowering your insulin. So how can you do that? With an effective diet and exercise regimen, which I will talk about in a future video on management, this is the only way you can lower your insulin and blood sugar to essentially make the disease disappear. Type 2 diabetes is reversible. I do want to stress that. Organizations and physicians today will say improve your diet, your physical activity, and of course, take this medication. So I do want to talk about medication for a minute. Remember how I just said that the only way you can cure type 2 diabetes is by lowering your blood sugar and thus your need for insulin? Well, for some reason, one type of medicine prescribed is aimed at increasing insulin. The thought process behind it is that, well, if the problem is the blood sugar and the pancreas can barely make any more insulin, let's just give people insulin, which, well, in theory works, but you'll still be trying to shove glucose into the cells that are just full. So this treatment works for a little bit, but then you're also speeding up the burnout from the beta cells in the pancreas. So it's generally accepted that this is not the best way to manage diabetes. There's also a reported risk of weight gain, which makes sense because your cells are storing so much fat and glycogen and you're trying to shove more and more into them. So then they keep expanding and you gain weight. Metformin and SGLT2 inhibitors are better because they aim to decrease insulin resistance, so make your cells more sensitive to insulin. And it exerts some effect on your appetite, so a lot of people report weight loss on metformin. But that's the thing. If your goal is to increase insulin sensitivity, you don't need to take medication. You can do that through specific nutritional changes and exercise so that you're not increasing your insulin response as much after you eat and your cells have time to burn off whatever they're storing, and insulin sensitivity can be restored, also resulting in weight loss and reversal of type 2 diabetes. I hope this helped answer some of your questions. Let me know if you have any other questions or comments. Join me in my next video, which will be on obesity. See you next time. Bye.